I went digging through the actual download numbers, the actual market share data, and the actual survey results behind this migration everyone's been quietly talking about. And honestly, what I found genuinely surprised me more than once in ways I genuinely did not expect going into this research. Millions of people are walking away from Windows right now, quietly, without any dramatic announcement. And they're doing it before a deadline most of them barely understood was coming until it was already staring them in the face. October is closing in fast, and the numbers behind this shift are not what most tech commentary has been telling you. Let's actually look at what's happening. Here's the deadline driving all of this, and it's genuinely worth being precise about the actual dates involved because there's genuinely been a lot of confusion floating around online, on forums, and even in some mainstream tech coverage. Microsoft officially ended free mainstream support for Windows 10 on October 14th, 2025. That meant no more free security patches, no more free bug fixes, nothing for an operating system that, at the time, was still running on roughly half of all Windows desktops worldwide. Microsoft did throw regular consumers a small lifeline, a program called Extended Security Updates, letting people keep receiving critical security patches for one additional year through October 13th, 2026, but only if they synced their PC to a Microsoft account, redeemed Microsoft rewards points, or paid a $30 fee. That one-year grace period is exactly the October deadline hanging over this entire story right now. Businesses have a longer runway through a separate, considerably more expensive enterprise ESU program stretching all the way to October 2028. But for the average person sitting at home, October 2026 is the real hard wall approaching. Now here's where the actual data gets genuinely interesting, because the standard advice from Microsoft, and honestly from most of the tech press, has been simple: just upgrade to Windows 11. But when you actually dig into why so many people aren't doing that, the picture becomes a lot messier and a lot more revealing about what's actually driving this exodus toward Linux specifically. Windows 11 enforces a genuinely strict set of hardware requirements. You need a trusted platform module, version 2.0 specifically, built directly into your motherboard. You need Secure Boot enabled, the exact same UEFI feature we've talked about before on this channel. And critically, you need a processor that appears on Microsoft's official, surprisingly narrow list of approved compatible CPUs. Put those three requirements together and you get a genuinely uncomfortable reality. According to HP and Dell, two of the largest PC manufacturers on the entire planet, roughly half of all PCs still in active use were still running Windows 10 as the original deadline approached, and a meaningful chunk of those machines are not eligible for a free Windows 11 upgrade at all, regardless of how badly their owners might actually want one. So think about the actual choice facing millions of ordinary people right now. Genuinely think it through the way they're forced to. Your perfectly functional laptop, the one you bought back in 2018 or 2019, still runs everything you need it to run just fine. It browses the web, it handles email, it plays your music, edits your documents, does your taxes, but it doesn't have the right chip, or it's missing that specific security module, so Windows 11 simply refuses to install on it. Your three options, laid out honestly, are these. Pay for a brand new computer, often costing several $100s or more, purely to keep running an operating system update. Pay Microsoft's extended security updates fee and kick the underlying problem down the road by exactly one single year. Or try something completely different. The third option is exactly where this story gets genuinely interesting, and honestly, where the actual data started shocking me the more I dug into it. Let's talk about Zorin OS, a Linux distribution specifically designed deliberately and intentionally to feel immediately familiar to anyone coming directly from Windows. When Zorin OS 18 launched, built on the widely respected GNOME desktop environment, it reached 200,000 downloads within just 2 days. 2 days. And here's the number that genuinely stopped me in my tracks when I first found it. 72% of those 200,000 downloads came directly from people who were previously running Microsoft Windows. That is not a niche community of longtime hardcore Linux enthusiasts quietly trading distributions among themselves. That is hundreds of thousands of completely ordinary Windows users actively, deliberately choosing to abandon the operating system they'd used for years in favor of something they'd probably never seriously tried before in their entire lives. Zorin is far from the only success story here either, and looking at which specific distributions are actually winning tells you something genuinely important about who's actually making the switch and why. A distribution called Bazite has emerged as one of the other standout winners of this entire migration wave, specifically built around gaming performance, deeply integrated with Valve's Proton compatibility layer, the technology that lets a huge percentage of Windows-only games actually run smoothly on Linux without any modification at all. That gaming angle genuinely matters here, because gaming has traditionally been considered Linux's single biggest, most persistent weakness. the one major use case. Windows always dominated completely and totally, without any real, credible competition. But the actual Steam hardware survey data tells a genuinely different story now. Linux's share of the Steam gaming platform hit 5.33% in March 2026, driven by a powerful combination of factors. Valve's own Steam Deck handheld device, running a Linux-based operating system by default, dramatically improved Proton compatibility across an ever-growing library of major game titles. And yes, the looming Windows 10, deadline pushing previously hesitant gamers to finally, seriously try an alternative they'd been putting off for years. If you're finding this data-driven breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because we're about to get into exactly why people are actually making this switch. And the real reasons genuinely surprised me, going well beyond simply dodging Microsoft's strict new hardware requirements. Let's talk about the deeper reasons behind this migration, because if you actually read through the growing community around this movement, from something called the End of 10 Project specifically, a genuine grassroots nonprofit initiative dedicated entirely to helping ordinary people move their aging Windows 10 machines onto Linux instead of the landfill. The reasons people give go considerably deeper than pure hardware compatibility frustration alone. The End of 10 Project's own messaging is refreshingly direct about this. If you bought your computer anytime after roughly 2010, there's genuinely no fundamental technical reason you need to throw it away. Installing an updated, modern Linux distribution can keep that exact same hardware running smoothly, securely, and reliably for years longer, completely free of charge, with software updates that remain free forever, indefinitely, with no subscription, no hidden fees, and no expiration date lurking somewhere down the road. That environmental angle turns out to be a genuinely significant part of this entire story too, one that honestly doesn't get nearly enough serious attention in most mainstream technology coverage. Environmental advocacy groups have been actively publicly pushing back against Microsoft's Windows 11 hardware requirements, specifically warning openly about a potentially massive surge in electronic waste as millions of perfectly functional computers get discarded simply because they're missing one specific security chip, or fall just outside an arbitrary, narrowly defined list of approved processors. When you genuinely think about the sheer physical scale involved here, roughly half of all Windows desktops worldwide still running Windows 10 as this deadline approached. That's not merely a minor inconvenience for a relatively small handful of unlucky individual users. That's potentially hundreds of millions of individual machines worldwide facing a real forced decision about their entire future right now, this year, all at essentially the exact same time. Let's talk honestly about privacy too, because it comes up constantly and consistently in genuine first-hand accounts from people who've actually made this specific switch themselves. A recurring, deeply consistent theme running through user testimonials collected by outlets covering this exact migration wave is a growing, mounting frustration with how heavily modern Windows has become saturated with advertising, telemetry data collection, and an increasingly aggressive, unavoidable push toward Microsoft's own bundled AI features, branded prominently as Copilot, features that a genuinely significant number of everyday users never explicitly asked for, and in many documented cases, genuinely do not actually want cluttering up their own personal computer. Linux distributions, by sharp, deliberate contrast, generally ship with dramatically less built-in telemetry, essentially zero bundled advertising of any kind. And crucially, the user retains full, complete control over whether or not to install any AI features at all, rather than having those exact features quietly, automatically pushed onto their machine by default through a routine, unavoidable system update they never explicitly opted into. Let's talk about what happens to the people who don't migrate at all, because understanding the actual security stakes here genuinely matters, and it connects directly back to something we've covered on this channel before. Once a Windows 10 machine falls outside both the free grace period and any paid extended security updates coverage, it stops receiving patches for newly discovered vulnerabilities entirely permanently. That's not a hypothetical, distant risk. Security researchers discover new Windows vulnerabilities on a genuinely constant, ongoing basis, and an unpatched operating system connected to the internet becomes an increasingly attractive, increasingly easy target over time, precisely because attackers know with total certainty that any vulnerability they discover in an end-of-life operating system will simply never get fixed. This is exactly the same underlying dynamic we discussed regarding secure boot certificate expiration, a device that looks and feels completely fine on the surface, booting up normally every single morning, while quietly, invisibly becoming less and less protected with every single month that passes without a security update. It's worth comparing this specific moment to how the previous major Windows end-of-life transition actually played out, because the comparison is genuinely revealing. When Windows 7 reached its own end of support back in January 2020, the migration pattern looked meaningfully different than what we're witnessing right now. Windows 10 was already firmly, overwhelmingly established as the clear dominant successor at that specific point in time. So the vast majority of Windows 7 holdouts simply moved directly over to Windows 10 without seriously entertaining any real alternative operating system at all. Linux barely registered as a meaningful destination during that entire earlier transition. This time around, the picture looks genuinely, fundamentally different, precisely because Windows 11's genuinely strict hardware requirements have created a real, substantial population of users who simply cannot follow that exact same well-worn, familiar path, even if they honestly wanted to. That structural difference, a hard technical wall rather than a mere simple software upgrade decision, is precisely the single biggest reason this particular transition looks so meaningfully different from every single previous Windows end-of-life event that came before it. Let's dig a bit deeper into which specific Linux distributions are actually capturing this wave of new users, because the landscape here has genuinely, meaningfully matured well beyond what most people who tried Linux once, years ago, and quietly gave up on might actually remember or expect. Linux Mint remains one of the most consistently recommended starting points for genuine Windows refugees, specifically, precisely because its default desktop layout, complete with a familiar taskbar, a traditional start menu equivalent, and a genuinely conventional overall file management system, requires remarkably little meaningful relearning for anyone coming directly from a Windows background. Ubuntu, likely the single most broadly recognized Linux distribution name among completely ordinary everyday people, continues to serve as a reliable, well-documented, heavily supported entry point as well, backed by a large commercial company called Canonical and an absolutely enormous, active, long-established global community. And then there's the newer wave we already discussed, Zorin OS, specifically designed and marketed to feel deliberately, intentionally Windows-like right out of the box in BASIC, specifically built from the ground up around gaming performance and seamless Steam integration. What's genuinely notable about this current specific moment in the broader history of desktop Linux is how dramatically the actual out-of-box experience has improved across virtually every single one of these major distributions, compared to where things stood even just 5 or 6 years ago. Hardware driver support, historically one of Linux's single most persistent, most consistently frustrating weak points for literal decades, has become dramatically more automated and more reliable across the vast majority of modern laptops and desktops. Software installation, which used to genuinely require typing intimidating, unfamiliar terminal commands that scared away countless curious beginners before they'd even gotten properly started, now increasingly happens through clean, polished graphical app stores that feel genuinely comparable in basic usability to the Microsoft Store or Apple's own App Store. And that steadily, meaningfully improving accessibility is precisely, directly, why a non-technical, completely ordinary person can now genuinely download Zorin OS, successfully install it themselves without extensive professional help, and be up and running comfortably within a single afternoon, rather than needing to spend an entire dedicated weekend to troubleshooting obscure, cryptic error messages the way earlier generations of hopeful Linux switchers often historically had to. And let's talk about cost specifically for a moment too, because the actual raw financial math here genuinely matters enormously to a large number of the people actually making this particular switch, especially during a period of persistent, widely felt economic pressure across many households. A brand new Windows 11 compatible laptop, even a genuinely basic entry-level one, typically runs somewhere in the range of $400 to $600 or considerably more, depending heavily on your specific region and particular retailer. Microsoft's extended security updates fee for individual consumers runs a comparatively modest $30, but that $30 payment only buys you exactly one additional year of security coverage, not any kind of genuine, lasting long-term solution to the underlying problem. Installing a Linux distribution, by sharp, direct contrast, costs precisely nothing at all, in literally every single case, on hardware you already personally own outright. For a family genuinely, carefully weighing spending several $100s on brand new hardware, purely to keep receiving routine security patches, against installing a completely free operating system on the exact same working computer they already have sitting right in front of them. The actual math here increasingly, genuinely favors Linux for a meaningfully growing number of households, particularly for people whose day-to-day computing needs are relatively modest. Web browsing, email, basic document editing, and streaming video content rather than highly specialized, demanding professional software. There's also a genuinely important enterprise and small business angle to this entire story that deserves real, serious mention here, even though most individual coverage of this migration wave has understandably tended to focus primarily on everyday home users rather than organizations. IT departments managing larger fleets of aging Windows 10 machines face a meaningfully different, considerably more complex calculation than any single individual consumer weighing their own personal choice. Migration costs at genuine organizational scale, testing critical business software for full compatibility, retraining entire teams of employees, updating detailed internal documentation, and established support procedures. All of that adds up quickly to real, substantial complexity and real, substantial expense. But as the tech target analysis we referenced earlier genuinely points out, those exact same organizational challenges are honestly no more daunting in most realistic practical cases than the challenges any organization would face migrating over to Windows 11 instead. Hardware compatibility testing, software validation, employee retraining, every single one of those exact same challenges exists regardless of which specific direction an organization ultimately chooses to move in. Given that reality, a meaningfully growing number of budget-conscious small businesses and cash-strapped nonprofit organizations have started seriously, genuinely evaluating Linux specifically as a way to avoid a costly, forced hardware refresh cycle entirely, particularly for machines primarily used for relatively basic, standardized office tasks rather than highly specialized, mission-critical proprietary software. Let's also talk honestly about who this migration wave genuinely isn't necessarily right for, because a fair, balanced, honest breakdown absolutely has to include that important nuance too, rather than pretending Linux represents some kind of universal, perfect solution for literally every single person currently facing this deadline. If your entire daily workflow depends heavily on specific, highly specialized professional software that simply has no genuine Linux equivalent, and no way to run reliably and smoothly through Windows compatibility layers like Wine or Proton either, migrating away from Windows entirely could honestly create real, meaningful, ongoing friction in your actual daily work rather than genuinely meaningfully solving anything for you personally. Certain specific categories of professional creative and engineering software, some advanced video editing suites, certain specialized computer-aided design tools remain genuinely Windows or Mac exclusive in practice, even in 2026, despite years of steady, incremental progress on this exact front. For those specific users, paying for extended security updates or investing in new Windows 11 compatible hardware may honestly, genuinely remain the more sensible, practical path forward, at least for the time being, until Linux software compatibility continues its own steady, ongoing improvement over the coming years ahead. Let's talk about gaming just a little bit more deeply, because it genuinely deserves closer attention as one of the single most surprising, unexpected success stories embedded within this entire broader migration wave. For literal decades, gaming was consistently cited as Linux's single most obvious, most persistent, most stubbornly unresolved weakness, the one major mainstream use case where Windows maintained such an overwhelming, dominant, essentially unchallenged advantage that switching away from Windows simply felt genuinely unthinkable for the vast majority of serious, dedicated gamers. Valve's sustained, years-long investment in Proton, its dedicated compatibility layer specifically designed to let unmodified Windows games run smoothly and reliably on Linux systems, has fundamentally, genuinely changed that entire long-standing equation in ways that honestly seemed almost unimaginable as recently as 5 or 6 years ago. Combine that steady technical progress with the wildly successful Steam Deck handheld gaming device, which ships with a Linux-based operating system by default, straight out of the box, introducing literally millions of completely ordinary gamers to Linux for the very first time in their lives, often without those same gamers even fully, consciously realizing they were technically using Linux at all while they played. And you get a genuinely powerful, self-reinforcing combination actively driving that 5.33% Steam gaming share we discussed earlier, a number that would have honestly sounded like pure science fiction fantasy to anyone seriously following the PC gaming industry as recently as 2018 or 2019. Now, I want to be genuinely honest with you here, because a good breakdown of this story absolutely has to include the real, meaningful friction points too, not just an uncritical, one-sided highlight reel of Linux's obvious advantages. Migration is not universally simple for everyone attempting it, and pretending otherwise would honestly be doing you a genuine disservice. Professionals and everyday individual users transitioning away from Windows both face very real practical challenges along the way. Application compatibility remains a genuinely significant hurdle for a meaningful subset of users, particularly anyone who depends heavily on specialized niche Windows-only software for work, professional creative projects, or highly specific technical hobbies. Peripheral device support, printers, scanners, certain specialized hardware accessories can occasionally require some genuine additional troubleshooting effort that most Windows users have simply never had to think about or deal with before in their entire computing lives. And there is undeniably a real learning curve involved, especially for people who have spent literally decades, in many documented cases, their entire working lives, using Windows and only Windows, without any serious, sustained exposure to any meaningfully different desktop computing paradigm. But here's the specific, genuinely important nuance that a lot of surface-level coverage of this entire migration story consistently misses. The various tools, tutorials, and dedicated support communities that have specifically grown up around this exact migration wave have gotten dramatically, genuinely better over just the past year alone. The End of 10 project specifically highlights and actively promotes tools like a utility called Operis, designed specifically to automate the tedious, often intimidating process of transferring your personal data, your saved application settings, and in many cases, a meaningful chunk of your actual installed applications, directly from an existing Windows 10 installation over onto a fresh, newly installed Linux system, all with dramatically reduced manual effort required, compared to how migrations have traditionally worked in years past. Local community support groups have also sprung up in a genuinely wide range of cities and regions, specifically to help complete. Beginners work through their first ever Linux installation in person, hands-on, rather than being left to figure out every single confusing step entirely alone, purely through scattered, inconsistent online forum posts and outdated video tutorials. Let's talk numbers again for a moment, because the trajectory here genuinely matters just as much as any single individual data point on its own. For literally decades, desktop Linux hovered stubbornly below roughly 4% total market share worldwide, a genuinely tiny, dedicated niche of committed hobbyists, professional software developers, and system administrators, essentially invisible to the vast majority of completely ordinary, everyday computer users going about their normal lives. Industry analysts covering this exact migration wave now project Linux could realistically reach double-digit market share by the end of 2026. An absolutely enormous, genuinely historic jump for an operating system that's been quietly, persistently stuck in the low single digits for literally decades on end without any meaningful, sustained movement whatsoever. For an industry that has spent literal decades joking, half seriously and half in genuine resignation, about a mythical, perpetually postponed year of the Linux desktop that always seemed to remain permanently, tantalizingly just out of actual reach. That specific, hard-fought milestone finally arriving in 2026 would honestly be a remarkably significant, historically noteworthy moment for the entire computing industry as a whole. Now, let's talk directly about search interest data, because this is honestly one of the more genuinely fascinating, if admittedly somewhat imprecise, signals floating around in this entire broader story. Multiple different outlets have reported a dramatic, roughly 5-fold increase in Google search volume, specifically for phrases like how to install Linux, tracked carefully around the February 2026 timeframe. Now, I want to be genuinely careful and honest with you here, because reputable technology commentary covering this exact same statistic has rightly, appropriately cautioned that raw Google Trends figures like this one can shift and fluctuate rapidly, and depend heavily on the exact specific time windows and geographic filters being applied to the underlying search data. So treat that specific 5-fold number as a genuinely useful directional signal of rapidly growing curiosity and interest, rather than as some kind of perfectly precise, scientifically rigorous measurement of the exact total number of people who have actually physically completed a real migration onto Linux themselves. But directionally, genuinely, that signal lines up remarkably well with literally everything else we've already walked through together. Rapidly growing download numbers for approachable, beginner-friendly Linux distributions, a meaningfully rising Linux share specifically on the Steam gaming platform, and a rapidly, visibly growing dedicated support ecosystem specifically built to help complete beginners make this exact same switch successfully. Here's what genuinely, honestly shocked me most as I worked carefully through all of this underlying data, and it's honestly not any single individual statistic taken entirely in isolation. It's the sheer, remarkable breadth of who's actually involved in this migration wave. This is not merely a story about die-hard, hardcore tech enthusiasts finally, predictably making a switch that Linux advocates have been confidently promising and predicting for literal decades on end. This is fundamentally, at its core, a story about completely ordinary people, everyday gamers switching specifically because of the Steam Deck and steadily improving Proton compatibility, budget-conscious families genuinely trying to keep an aging laptop from a full decade ago running smoothly for just a few more years, without buying an expensive replacement, environmentally conscious individuals actively trying to keep functional, working hardware entirely out of overflowing landfills, and privacy-conscious users who have simply finally grown tired of an operating system that increasingly seems to work primarily for Microsoft's own commercial interests, rather than genuinely, primarily for them as the actual paying customer. If you appreciate this kind of honest, data-grounded breakdown, one that genuinely digs carefully into real numbers rather than simply repeating vague, secondhand vibes about a supposed migration trend, make sure you're subscribed, because that's precisely, exactly the kind of story we specifically try to tell here, week after week. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth mentioning before we wrap up, because it directly addresses a question a lot of skeptical viewers are probably already asking right now. Isn't this just a temporary spike, driven entirely by a single, one-time deadline, likely to fade away completely once the initial October panic passes and people settle back into whatever they were already comfortable using before? That's a genuinely fair, reasonable question, and honestly, nobody can predict the future with complete certainty here. But the underlying structural factors driving this particular migration wave look meaningfully more durable than a typical short-lived news cycle spike. Valve's continued investment in Proton and the Steam Deck ecosystem isn't going away, regardless of what happens with Windows 10 specifically. The improved out-of-box hardware support and dramatically simplified installation experience across major Linux distributions represents years of accumulated genuine engineering progress, not some kind of temporary marketing push tied to one single deadline. And the underlying frustrations driving people toward Linux in the first place, telemetry, bundled advertising, unwanted AI features, growing hardware requirements, show no obvious signs of reversing course anytime soon either. If anything, those exact same underlying frustrations seem likely to keep growing steadily over time, not shrink, which suggests this particular migration wave may well represent a genuine, lasting structural shift, rather than merely a temporary, short-lived blip destined to fade quietly away once October 2026 finally actually arrives and passes. Let's talk practically now, in genuinely concrete terms, about what this actually means if you personally happen to be one of the millions of people still currently sitting on Windows 10 right now, watching this specific October deadline steadily approach with at least some low-grade background anxiety. If your machine genuinely does support Windows 11 and you're personally comfortable with Microsoft's broader overall approach and general direction, upgrading remains a perfectly reasonable, sensible, low-friction choice for plenty of people. Nobody should feel any real pressure to abandon Windows purely because it's suddenly become fashionable or trendy to do so among a certain vocal, enthusiastic online crowd. But if your specific machine falls outside Windows 11's genuinely strict hardware requirements, or if you're simply honestly tired of accumulating advertisements, telemetry data collection, and unwanted AI features bundled directly into your own personal computer without ever really asking for any of it, the actual real-world data we've just walked through together suggests you would genuinely be in remarkably good, well-established company making the switch to Linux instead. Hundreds of thousands of people have already successfully done exactly that within just the past several months alone. And the dedicated tools, tutorials, and genuinely active support, communities specifically built to help you through that same transition, have never, at any prior point, been more mature, accessible, or genuinely beginner-friendly than they are right here, right now, in the middle of 2026. The October deadline is real, it's fast approaching, and it's forcing an enormous, genuinely unprecedented number of completely ordinary people to seriously, carefully consider options they might have otherwise, under normal circumstances, simply never gotten around to exploring at all. Some of them will ultimately choose to pay Microsoft's modest extended security updates fee and quietly kick this entire underlying decision one full year further down the road, buying themselves a little more time to think things over carefully without any real immediate pressure. Some will finally decisively buy that new Windows 11 compatible machine they've genuinely been putting off purchasing for a while now anyway, treating this deadline as the final necessary push they honestly needed all along. And based on everything the actual underlying data genuinely shows us right now, a meaningfully large, rapidly growing number of them are going to open up a completely unfamiliar Linux installer for the very first time in their entire lives, click through a handful of remarkably straightforward setup screens, and discover, often to their own genuine personal surprise, that their supposedly outdated, obsolete old computer still has plenty of useful, productive life left in it after all running an operating system that, for the first time in literal decades, is finally genuinely ready to properly welcome them.